The Texas sun didn't care who had won or lost. It burned the same for everyone. A line of German prisoners stepped down from the back of an army truck, squinting against the glare. Their boots crunched on dry gravel. These were men captured in North Africa and Europe, soldiers who had faced tanks, sandstorms, and bombers. They had been told that American prison camps were brutal places filled with hunger and punishment. But what they saw was cattle. Across the open plain stood a man in a wide-brimmed hat, rope slung over his shoulder, boots dusty from the trail. A cowboy. He tipped his hat and spoke through a translator. "You boys will be helping us work the ranch. Fence mending, cattle drives, whatever needs doing." The Germans exchanged confused glances. Work the ranch? No barking guards? No cells? Just cows? Within a day, they found themselves riding in pickup trucks, trailing herds through shimmering heat. Cowboys whistled, yelled, and laughed as they guided the animals. The prisoners watched in disbelief. These Americans didn't look like conquerors. They looked like men who knew the land and respected it. Instead of rifles, the prisoners were handed work gloves. Instead of shouted orders, they got calm directions. A cowboy showed one of them how to fix a fence, pointing and gesturing until the young soldier understood. It was hard work, hammering posts, hauling wire, breathing dust. But it was human. Meals were another surprise. Instead of thin soup, they were given real food: meat, potatoes, coffee strong enough to jolt a man awake. Some hadn't tasted beef in years. Around the mess tables, the prisoners ate silently at first, unsure if it was a trick. But as the days passed, suspicion turned to quiet amazement. One young German stared at the endless horizon and muttered, "This isn't imprisonment. This is another life." He wasn't wrong. The ranch was fenced, yes, and guarded, but it wasn't a cage. The open range stretched farther than the eye could see, an ocean of grass and sky. There was no barbed wire that could contain that feeling of space. Many of the cowboys were just regular Texans, too young or too old to serve overseas. They didn't care about politics or propaganda. They cared if a man could pull his weight. "If you can work, you're all right," one said with a shrug. For the Germans, it was the first crack in the image they'd been fed for years. The enemy wasn't cruel or chaotic. He was steady, friendly, and most shocking of all, fair. By the end of that first week, the prisoners had sunburns, blisters, and stories they could hardly believe. They had expected to suffer. Instead, they were working side by side with men who treated them not as enemies, but as hands, temporary ranch workers in the middle of a war. And under that vast, endless sky, one thought began to spread quietly through the camp. Maybe everything they had been told about America was wrong. By 1943, the Allies had a problem no one expected: too many prisoners. From the deserts of North Africa to the fields of Sicily, thousands of German soldiers were surrendering every week. Britain was full, its camps overflowing, so the United States offered a solution: ship them across the ocean, far from the war, to a place with space, food, and sunshine. That place was Texas. It made perfect sense. Texas had land, isolation, and an agricultural economy that desperately needed hands. Trains carrying German POWs rolled inland from the ports of Houston and Galveston, their windows barred but open to the view. Through them, the prisoners saw something that didn't fit their expectations: towns untouched by war, fields of cotton and wheat, stores full of food, and children playing in front yards. Back home, German cities were burning. Here, life went on. Many of the men whispered in disbelief. The Nazi newspapers had described America as a land of chaos and crime, a place collapsing under greed and corruption. But the America outside those train windows was calm and rich. No bombed-out ruins, no shortages, no fear. When the trains stopped near towns like Herne, Huntsville, or Bastrop, the prisoners braced for punishment. They expected beatings, starvation, maybe even execution. Instead, they were met with military discipline, but also order and fairness. The camps followed the Geneva Convention, something most Germans had only heard about. Prisoners had to be given shelter, medical care, and enough food to stay healthy. They received soap, clothing, and 3 full meals a day. There were guard towers and fences, yes, but inside those fences were soccer fields, libraries, and even classes run by fellow prisoners. It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't cruelty either. For American authorities, the goal was simple: keep the prisoners busy and useful. The U.S. Army was short on manpower. Millions of American men were overseas. Farms and ranches back home were struggling. The War Department decided that POWs could help. Local farmers and ranchers could hire prisoners through the government, paying wages that went to the Army. The prisoners themselves received small credits they could spend in camp stores on cigarettes, candy, or soap. It was a strange arrangement that worked for everyone. Texans got much-needed labor. The Army reduced its costs, and the Germans, who had expected punishment, found purpose in work. Still, the first weeks were tense. Locals stared when trucks full of enemy soldiers passed by. Some families worried about having Nazis nearby. But those fears faded quickly when people saw who the prisoners really were. Tired young men, barely out of their teens, more like farm boys than fanatics. A few guards even joked that the only danger the Germans posed was eating too much. By the end of the year, nearly 50,000 German POWs were scattered across Texas in dozens of camps. Some large military compounds, others small satellite camps built near cotton fields or cattle ranches. It was an invisible army of laborers helping to feed a nation at war. And as they worked, the prisoners began to notice something that no propaganda could hide. America wasn't just strong because of its soldiers. It was strong because of its stability, because even in wartime, ordinary people kept the land alive. The first morning on the ranch felt unreal. The German prisoners were used to orders, inspections, and shouting. Now, a cowboy pointed toward a pile of fence posts and said just one word: work. The men hesitated. They had fought for the German army, worn uniforms with eagles and swastikas. Now they were being asked to dig holes, haul wire, and fix fences under the Texas sun. Some refused at first, but hunger and boredom are powerful teachers. Within hours, most picked up tools and followed the cowboys' lead. The work was tough. The heat was relentless, the dust thick, the distances endless. A short ride to check cattle could take hours. The longhorns were nothing like the calm dairy cows of Bavaria. They were massive, stubborn, sometimes dangerous. The prisoners learned quickly to stay alert. One young soldier wrote later, "I fought in Tunisia and Sicily, survived bombings and heat. But chasing Texas cattle, this was a new kind of battle." The cowboys were a different kind of teacher. They didn't bark orders or talk about politics. They worked side by side, showing with gestures and patience how to do things right. They fixed fences, roped calves, loaded hay, and expected the Germans to keep up. At first, the cowboys kept their distance. Many had lost brothers or friends overseas. They didn't know what to make of the enemy working in their fields. But it didn't take long to see these Nazis weren't monsters. They were just skinny young men trying to get through the day. "Out here," one cowboy said later, "work made us all the same." By the end of the first week, the prisoners' hands were blistered, their backs sore, but their pride was returning. They were doing real work again, something that mattered. In a strange way, the ranch gave them dignity. Meals became moments of quiet connection. Cowboys brought food out to the fields: beans, cornbread, strong coffee. The prisoners ate gratefully, still amazed at how much there was to go around. Some shared jokes in broken English and German, laughing over hand gestures and mistakes. Every now and then, the guards turned a blind eye while a prisoner tried his hand at riding a horse. It didn't always end well. But those moments, the laughter, the dust, the open sky, felt like tiny pieces of freedom. The more they worked, the more they noticed a pattern. The cowboys respected hard work more than rank. A man who could rope a steer or fix a fence earned trust. No one cared where you were born or what uniform you once wore. For soldiers raised in a world of strict rules and hierarchy, this was shocking. Freedom here wasn't about orders, it was about responsibility. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills, a prisoner looked across the pasture and said quietly, "They don't treat us like enemies. They treat us like men." That simple truth spread through the camp faster than any rumor. For the first time, these German soldiers began to see America not as a threat, but as a mystery worth understanding. A country where even the enemy could share a laugh over a fence post and a cup of coffee. War had taught the German prisoners to measure strength in weapons and victories. But in Texas, they learned a different kind of math, one that had nothing to do with guns. It started with food. Back home, families survived on watery soup and black bread. At the front, soldiers ate just enough to keep moving. But in Texas, even prisoners were fed like farmhands. Every day brought meat, potatoes, vegetables, and thick coffee that never seemed to run out. Some men stared at their plates, unable to believe it was real. One wrote in his diary, "I have never eaten so much in my life, not even as a free man." The meals told a story that propaganda couldn't hide. If America could feed its prisoners this well, what was it doing for its own citizens and soldiers? Then came the land. Texas seemed endless. The ranches stretched for miles, dotted with cattle herds so large they looked like moving rivers of brown and white. A German farm back home might have 20 cows. Here, a single rancher had thousands. The prisoners began to realize that America's strength wasn't just in factories or weapons. It was in sheer scale. Everywhere they looked, there was proof of plenty. Tractors rumbling across fields, trucks hauling feed, barns packed with grain. The numbers were staggering. Millions of acres under cultivation, tens of millions of cattle. And this was only one state. At night, the prisoners whispered about what they'd seen. "If this is how much food one ranch makes," one said, "how can Germany ever win?" The more they worked, the clearer it became. America's power was built on efficiency. Nothing went to waste. Broken tools were fixed. Work was shared. A fence repaired in time could save a whole herd. It wasn't military discipline that kept things running. It was common sense and cooperation. Even the smallest details shocked them. Their labor was paid for, 80 cents a day, credited to the U.S. Army, with a few cents given back as canteen tokens. They could buy cigarettes, candy, or soda. It was more than many German civilians could afford in 1944. And when the guards handed out newspapers, the truth became impossible to ignore. American factories were producing tanks, planes, and ships at a rate Germany couldn't imagine. In 1944 alone, the U.S. built nearly 100,000 aircraft. Even the ranches seemed part of that same unstoppable machine, feeding soldiers, workers, and now even their enemies. The Germans didn't talk about it openly, but the realization spread quietly. America wasn't winning the war just with soldiers. It was winning with systems, with food, energy, and organization on a scale the right could never match. One officer admitted years later, "We thought America was soft, but in Texas, we saw its real power. It wasn't the army. It was the land, the work." For the men sweating under the Texas sun, that lesson hit harder than any defeat. The math of war had changed. Victory wasn't about who could shout louder or march straighter. It was about who could build more, feed more, and last longer. And under those endless skies, the prisoners learned that America's greatest weapon wasn't force. It was abundance. When the war finally ended in 1945, the German prisoners packed their things and prepared to go home. But home wasn't what it used to be. The Germany they returned to was a country in ruins. Cities bombed to dust, bridges collapsed, railways broken, families scattered. Many stepped off trains and barely recognized their own towns. For men who had spent the last years in Texas, the shock was overwhelming. They had lived as prisoners with more food, comfort, and stability than their families had ever known in wartime. One former POW wrote, "I came back to Germany a free man, but poorer than when I was a prisoner." That contrast left a mark. The prisoners brought something back with them. Lessons learned not from generals, but from cowboys. They had seen how Americans worked, efficient, practical, and confident. They had watched men fix broken tools instead of throwing them away, plan their work before starting, and treat labor as a badge of pride, not humiliation. On Texas ranches, they'd learned that freedom and discipline could exist together, that respect was earned by skill and effort, not by rank or ideology. In the years that followed, many of those former POWs became farmers, engineers, or small business owners in the new West Germany. They used what they'd seen, better ways to organize, to produce, to rebuild. Some even introduced American farming methods like crop rotation and modern ranching techniques. They also carried back a new idea of fairness. Cowboys had treated them like men, not enemies. Guards had enforced rules, yes, but with a sense of humanity. That memory challenged everything Nazi propaganda had told them about America. For many, it became proof that dignity didn't depend on power. It came from how people treated each other. Letters began crossing the ocean. Former prisoners wrote to ranchers who had fed them, to guards who'd shared cigarettes, to families who had shown kindness. Some were invited back. A few even immigrated permanently, settling in the same Texas towns where they'd once been held captive. Their stories spread quietly through post-war Germany. They spoke not of defeat, but of understanding, how a country's real strength could come from openness, not fear. That idea found its way into the rebuilding of a new Germany, one that focused on cooperation, production, and freedom instead of conquest. When historians later called it the German economic miracle, few mentioned the role of former POWs. But those men knew. They had seen abundance in action. They had seen how a society could rebuild by trusting work over words, efficiency over slogans. Years later, one old prisoner wrote, "The Cowboys showed me something our leaders never did. That freedom works best when it's shared." The barbed wire and guard towers are long gone now, But the lessons that crossed the Atlantic with those men never disappeared. They became part of the quiet connection between two former enemies who learned through hard work and simple decency that respect can outlast any war. If you enjoyed this story about humanity in the middle of chaos, don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore more hidden chapters of World War II history with us. Sometimes, the most powerful victories happen far from the battlefield.